great. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Can I start my... there it is. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here, and I especially appreciate the positioning of my material right after Philip Kotler's wise words, because as you know, he talked a lot about innovation. And innovation and marketing taken together are really the drivers of growth in our companies. But the second reason why I'm glad to be here in Delhi is, as you know, I'm from California, and we have done very well in California with innovation the last 20, 30 years. Google and Apple and Twitter and all these companies that we talk a lot about, Tesla, they're all in California. But honestly, none of these companies would be successful if it wasn't for the contributions of people from your country. The first time that I walked into one of the buildings at Google, and I look around and I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm the only non-Indian person here. It is amazing how much your people, and especially your young people, are contributing to that innovation all over the world. And so I'm honored to be here and to share these few words with you. Well, look, so my talk is about rewards of innovation, and with particular reference to that new digital age that we're into that's already been talked about. So here's a couple of points I want to raise to make it in 3 bullets. If we talk about innovation, I would say generally from a consumer perspective, that's pretty positive. It's kind of a nice word in the sense that it exudes a lot of enthusiasm, making things better. But if you talk to senior executives in companies, innovation is not so obvious. And there's 2 very basic reasons for that. Number one, it's risky. Depending on the sector, and this is an American statistic, up to 80% of new products fail. The failure rate is very high. And that makes executives, of course, very reluctant to engage in innovation for obvious reasons. And then the second is, it's expensive. It usually comes with R&D budgets and launch budgets on the marketing side and so forth, market research. So it tends to be expensive. And therefore, we raise the question, well, innovation is a very positive construct. But from a managerial perspective, it raises a bunch of questions about investments in innovation. So what do we know about the net benefit, the net financial results of innovative firms, and most of all, under what conditions does innovation tend to be successful or less successful? And so I hope with that overview, which will be very much based on the extensive research on this topic that has been done, I hope to give you a few pointers about managing innovation in a way that is more successful than has been in the past. In other words, we can't afford that 80% failure rate anymore, not in the 21st century. So in doing that, can I have a slide here? Oh, here we go. Let's take a quick look at the past at some famous statements by then famous people about innovation. Go back to, 1899, where the commissioner of the U.S. Patents Office, this is somebody who should know something about innovation. He says, well, okay, everything that has been invented has already been, and everything that can be invented has already been invented. We're done. Okay, not quite. Move the clock to 1943, where the president of IBM, Mr. Watson, says, I think there's a world market, maybe 5 computers. Okay. Slightly wrong. Okay. Now you may say, well, that's 1940, it's a long time ago. But let's go into the 21st century, where a very well-known entrepreneur in the US, very successful entrepreneur, basically says that buying YouTube, which is what Google did, is nonsensical. That's never going to work. And so the point being is that we keep on getting it wrong, and even very, very knowledgeable people get it wrong about which innovations can be successful and which ones cannot. So therefore, it is difficult, it is risky to engage in innovative strategies. So what I want to do here is say, but wait a minute, there are patterns of success in innovation. There are things that we can predict in such a way that we can reduce the risk and not launch so many failed products. And when I say products, by the way, I always mean product or service. Okay? So in order to do that, first let's take a look at the typical sales cycle that we see for an innovative product. Okay? Yeah. It's called the product life cycle. You probably are familiar with it. It just basically says that successful new products move through an S shape. Okay? Now, and we heard from Philip Kotler earlier a very good example of the latter part, the decline part, which was the film industry when the digital technology came up. Okay? But now moving to the front part, see, there's a problem there. The problem is that the introduction phase can take a long time. It can take 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and you're probably losing money if you're there. But somewhere along the line, that growth is right behind you, and you have to have the patience to stick it out until the growth materializes, and then, of course, you have the profitability that comes with it. So can we say something about that pattern when it applies to our products or our services that we launch? Well, fortunately, okay, one forward. All right. What do we know about innovations that diffuse rapidly? I'm basing this on quite a bit of research that's been done. You see a reference there. And at least in English, we call it the Accord principle. It's not the Honda Accord. It's ACCORD. And memorize that. This is important. Okay? The first is A. Okay? Your new product, obviously, has to offer some competitive advantage. There has to be a reason for consumers to want to change their habits and buy your product, not some old product. Okay? That's measurable. Okay? That competitive advantage has to be serious. It can't be just a little bit better. It has to be tangibly better. Okay? Offering new values or new services to the customers that you're aiming for. Okay? But a lot of people in the innovation business think that that's enough. Oh, if I have a better product, obviously it will be successful because it's better. But interestingly enough, that's actually not true. There are 5 other factors that play a role. Let me briefly review those. The second condition for successful new products or innovative products is not being complex. Not being, in other words, you don't want to be complex, you want to be not complex. Now that's the challenge. I'm an academic, and academics love complexity. Okay? We like to solve difficult problems, and we talk to each other and say, look what I can do, and you can't do it. Okay? That's not the way to go in successful innovation. Because the engineers, or the academics, or the scientists, they may like complexity, but the consumer doesn't. The consumer wants things to be simple, or, as Einstein would say, make things as simple as possible, but not any simpler. So, complexity depresses innovation. So whatever you can do with a new product to make it easier to understand, easier to use, is going to help with faster diffusion. That's number 2. Number 3, extremely important, compatible with past behavior. So they go something like this. If you drive a car, and you have been driving several cars over the years, you know exactly how that goes. You drive the car, you look at your gasoline meter, when it goes down, you say, okay, time to go to a service station and fill it up. And once a year you get, or twice a year, you get the tires checked and you get the oil replaced. And we've all learned how to do that. Now comes the electric car. Laura has already talked about that. Now comes Tesla, or one of the competitors. What's the difference between driving a Tesla and driving a gasoline automobile? Basically, there's no difference. The driving is just the same. It's got maybe better acceleration, but that's about it. Oh, and it's silent. Okay. The problem is when the range is getting low, when you only have 20 miles to go, because you can't just stop and fill it up in 5 minutes. It takes many hours, depending on the charger, to fill up the car or reduce it. So therefore, you're asking your consumer to actually now start planning. Start saying, okay, I'm going to drive from here to here, that's 100 miles. Okay, then I have maybe 100 miles left on my range, so I need to find a place to juice it up over there, and so on and so forth. There is this planning that needs to happen when you drive an electric car that you didn't have to do when you have a gasoline car. Okay? That depresses innovation. Just the fact that it's not compatible with the way we used to do things. So therefore, anything you can do with your product, with your new product, to make it as compatible as possible with the previous generation will help in the future. That's why, by the way, software manufacturers, when they launch a new version of a software, they always make sure that you can still use the old version. Okay? Because if they don't do that, you're asking major behavioral change in your consumers' habits. Fourth one, can you show that your new product has benefits that are observable? Because you're asking your consumer to change behavior, and the consumer says, okay, what's in it for me? In some cases, the results are instant, are very observable. Now, for example, there's a company in California that, this is now in financial services, that in the mortgage business, in the typical mortgage business, when you buy a house, you need to qualify for a loan, you present all of your data to the bank takes 2 weeks to check everything, and then they call you and they say, your loan is approved or your loan is not approved. That's sort of the way things happen now. Okay. There's a few banks now that have, and especially one, that have made that process totally digitally enabled. Which means you go in, you submit your data, very simple data because the network with all data sources anyway, and in about 2 hours you get the result that says you're approved or you're not approved. Okay. That is an immediately observable benefit of the innovation. Because now you can go to your seller and say, I want to buy your house and here is proof that I can pay for it. Okay. That changes things. That causes rapid diffusion. And then finally, the obvious one, innovations that are less risky and that are diversifiable are going to do better. So in the case of cars, I have an electric car, but I didn't buy it. Because I don't know if that battery will still be good in 5 or 6 years. No, I leased it. So after 3 years, it's not my problem anymore. It's out the door. And somebody else can deal with the fact that maybe the battery is still good, maybe not, because I don't know. Okay. So the fact that there's a leasing opportunity reduces my risk of buying, in this case, an electric car, and that helps diffusion. So these are 5 or 6 major factors, and time and again we see innovations that succeed or that fail because they score high or low on these factors. Okay. So that's my first overall point. Second point, how new should your innovation be? It can be a little bit new, or it can be totally different. There's a very interesting result. I showed the academic reference there, that the extremes actually do the best. Okay? So if your innovation is a little bit new, now it's not risky, people understand it, that does well financially. In other words, 1 year later you have a higher rate of consumer acceptance. And if it's totally new, that attracts people too, under the conditions that I talked about. The stuff in the middle, not so great. Okay. So working in the innovation field at these two extremes has been proven to be a very, very successful strategy. So those are the principles I wanted to share with you on the consumer side. But that's only half the story. Because as those of you who work on new product development or innovation or entrepreneurs here in the audience, as you will know, one of the critical things is, where am I going to get the money that finances my innovation? Innovation is easy to talk about, but it is not easy to put in practice. Okay? So therefore, we need to learn something about innovation from an investor perspective. Now, that's difficult because that world, the world of investing, tends to be secretive. You know, you invested something, let's say a company makes a certain investment, that's not necessarily widely known, an investment in innovation. But fortunately, we have some very good databases that have allowed us to study the investor perspective. And so what I'm going to do here is basically cover the following. Number one, does the investment community reward you for innovation? Number two, how about doing other things with your resources? Like, for example, why don't you skip the innovation, just offer rebates? Wouldn't that be better? Because it's cheap and it drives demand. Okay, so I'll make that comparison. And then the third and last point will be, do I have to wait a long time before my investors get rewarded? Is it a long patience job, or can it be achieved more quickly? So those are the 3 points I'd like to raise there. First point, do investors reward innovation? Well, we only know the answer from publicly listed firms, but that's the start, and there's lots of them. You see there we have data, and I'm listing the references there, 22,000 consumer innovations, and about 400 automotive innovations. This is a pretty large sample. Okay? And if you take a look at these innovations as launched by publicly available companies, you can take a look at their stock price. That is ultimately the measure of how the investor community rewards the innovation. And especially in the US market, where all you hear in that domain is that investors are short-term oriented. All they care about is this quarter's profits or this quarter's earnings. Okay? So if that's the mentality, then why should you invest in innovation? So when we actually study this carefully, it takes a fair amount of statistical work and big data, lots of databases, in order to study this, you actually find a much, much more uplifting story. You find, first of all, that the long-term effect of innovation on firm value is positive, even though it is risky and it is costly. But there's a positive effect. And secondly, it's more positive for radical innovations than for little ones. That's really good news. The fact that the investor community tends to reward innovative companies, which then, of course, prompt those companies to invest even more in this innovation. Here's an example in the automotive sector, some work that I did some time ago. These numbers are just basically measures of strength. You know, for those of you with economics background, there are elasticities. But if you don't have that background, it's fine. Just the higher numbers suggest a stronger effect. So what happens when companies innovate in this sector? It's basically all positive. Top line revenue goes up, short-term, long-term. Profits go up, short-term, long-term, and firm value goes up, especially in the long-term. Okay. All right. Now, let's contrast that with rebate. Car companies do that all the time. They say, this month, $2,000 off my car. You see it everywhere, and not just in automotive. You see it in lots of sectors. Well, what happens to revenue? It's actually good news. Short term goes up, long term goes up. You say, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that you cut your margins. So short term, on the profitability side, there's still some positive effect. Long term, profitability goes down. And this relates to the branding that Laura Rees talked about, because as you're discounting your products, you lose brand value. And if you discount too frequently, people actually don't want to pay the regular price anymore. They say, I'll just wait till the next promotion and then I'll buy. But then when everybody does that, your profit margins get squeezed. So promotions, rebates are fine if they're done once in a while, but not a long-run strategy. Okay. Now then the question is, do investors know that? Okay, well, actually they do. Because you see there that negative long-term profit effect in the second row is mirrored by a negative long-run firm value effect. There's a very interesting phenomenon going on in the market, in the investor marketplace. Okay? So firms that innovate get rewarded by the stock market, both short and long term, and firms that do more rebates, they may get a little bit of short-term lift, yes, but long-term, their value goes down. So the investor market is actually pretty clever. They see through the fact that you're raising your revenue by constantly offering better deals, and that's not a good long-run strategy. So I have, and just an example here for SUVs, I have a half a dozen brands. There are some Japanese brands and some American brands, and they all behave the same way. When they offer $1,000 more in rebate, their market value goes down. And when they offer a new product introduction, their market value goes up. So on the investor side, the message is quite clear that even though we think that markets are so short-term oriented, they're really not. They really do look at innovation as a positive contributor, and that is wonderful news for anybody needing funds in order to conduct innovation. That's really great news. There is not much evidence of myopia in the markets. Here's an example. You may recognize this car. This is a minivan this is a Honda minivan. And so here's what happened in the 90s. Every time they sold one, before 99, the company made, about $1,200 or $1,300 profit. And then something happened in 99, and suddenly they make $3,500 profits on each car sold. But it's the same car. It's just like you see it there. Maybe slightly different headlights or something, but it's basically the same car, except for one thing. If anyone here has a minivan, you will appreciate this. If you have a minivan, there's 2 people in the front, 3 people in the middle, and then 3 people in the back, right? So 8 people can sit there, wonderful. But there's a problem. There is no more room for luggage. Because that third row allows maybe this much room for luggage. That's the problem. You say, well, there's a solution for that. That third row, you take it out, and you put it in the garage. And now you can only carry 5 people, but you have a big trunk. The problem is, you have to take that thing out, put it in the garage. Hopefully you have a garage. Okay? So this is really a hassle. What the engineers at Honda did, they figured out a way to take that third row and sink it into the platform of the car. That's the innovation. Just take it up and sink it into the platform. And as you probably know, since then others have imitated that. Okay? Now what does that innovation do? It triples the profitability of the car sold. The sales also went up quite a bit, but it's that profitability that interests me here the most, because that's going to drive the value, of course, of the firm, and also, as you see, it's very, very sustained. It stays at a high level. All right. I have one last conclusion one last point before getting to my overall conclusions, and that is the question that I promised I would answer. Do you have to wait a long time before you see the results and your investors get rewarded? Again, there's good news here. I showed you earlier the product life cycle, that S-shape. From the start till the peak, in cars, for example, it's typically about 5 or 6 years. Okay, so it takes a long time before you reach that peak potential. But what if you have an innovation? How long does it take the investor community to figure out that that's a winner? Well, we know that at least in the US market, because there is a market research firm there, this gets me to the big data point, that registers most of the car sales in the country. They have a network of dealers, it's about 70% of the country, where when you buy your car, as you do the transaction, all the data gets shipped to that market research firm, and they just add it all up. And every Friday, they organize a telephone call. And you have to pay to listen to the call. What do they do in the call? It's very boring. They just go through all the car models and they say, this week they sold so many, and importantly, they sold at, let's say, 95% of full price or 72% of full price, which gives you an idea of how much bargaining there is. And therefore that attracts profitability. Now, the people listening on the call on Friday, of course, are, first of all, the automotive executives. They want to know how their cars are doing. But the other people listening are the stock analysts, okay, that are influencing the investor community. And they're listening, and then they do buy or sell orders in function of these numbers. And so what happens as a result of that information spreading quickly, the stock market, at least in my example here, makes up its mind about the value of the innovation in, about 6 to 7 weeks. So if you're an investor, even though on the consumer side, the fruit of your innovation won't be seen till maybe 3, 4, 5 years later, the rewards in terms of firm value kick in, as you see there, 6, 7, 8 weeks. But only if there's transparency. Okay? So in other words, there's some data available, which makes me raise an important issue about this whole field into the 21st century. The more transparency we have about which innovations are doing well, leave it up to the investors to make the long-run inferences. They can do that. So that in a matter of weeks, you could give your investor community the rewards that they look for taking a risk. And that, again, is very good news for product innovation, because with short-term rewards, of course, comes a higher willingness to make the investments. So, I'm ready to conclude, and my conclusion goes as follows. You know, innovation is a positive thing, but it's risky, and it often leads to failure. So those are problems. However, we've learned about patterns of adoption, and we can apply these patterns to every new innovation and make a reasonable prediction as to whether the innovation will be successful, or if it's not going to be successful, teach management what to change to make it successful. So that's sort of point one. Okay? Point two, innovation is not only about better products. There are 5 other criteria, and I've reviewed them, having a lot to do with what are you expecting your consumers to do, how much of their behavior has to change, because that impacts their willingness to adopt the innovation. Point 3, don't worry about these statements that the stock market only looks at short term. It looks like it's true, but it's not true. They are very much long-run invented, and you get rewarded for innovative policies in the financial markets. And number 4, the reaction is much faster on the investor market than it is on the consumer market. And that's also good news in the sense that you can reap the benefits, the financial benefits of your innovation more quickly than the consumer benefits will materialize over time. So we'll stop here. I very much appreciate this opportunity, and I thank you for your attention.